Beijing's Belt and Road Initiative, launched in 2013, has seen China's overseas lending footprint increase drastically. As per a new report from AidData, a research lab at the College of William and Mary in the United States of America, China has lent at least $1.34 trillion to 165 low and middle income countries between 2000 and 2021. Today, the outstanding debt owed to Beijing is at least $1.1 trillion in principal, excluding interest. Between 2014 to 2021, Beijing outspent the US 2:1 in overseas lending, coming in roughly at $680 billion during this 7-year period, in comparison to US's $319 billion in overseas lending, according to the latest report from AidData. We have with us Dr. Bradley Parks, one of the lead authors of the new report and an executive director of AidData. Good to have you with us, Dr. Parks.
Thanks for having me.
To get right in, and my first question is, in the report, the researchers argue that there is an evolution in the Belt and Road Initiative, that there is an early period, 2014 to 2017, and a latter period, 2018 to 2021. So for the benefit of our viewers, how did the researchers arrive at using the data to make this argument?
The conventional wisdom about China's overseas lending program is that there was a boom period and a bust period. China lent extraordinary amounts to low-income and middle-income countries and got overextended. And as a result of getting overextended, several publicly available databases other than our own suggest that China's overseas lending actually plummeted in the last few years to zero or nearly zero. And that's just not what we found. We looked at the entire suite of state-owned creditors and donors in China. There's 791 of them. And when you broaden the aperture and look at all of these official sector sources of aid and credit, what we find is that China's providing about $80 billion a year in aid and credit to the developing world. And as a point of comparison, US is providing about $60 billion a year. So in order to understand why China's overseas lending program remains so strong, despite all of the problems that it's encountered and its high level of exposure to non-performing loans or distressed debt, you really have to understand the problems that Beijing is trying to solve with this program. So if you were sitting in Beijing right now and you were looking at a global dashboard, what would you see? You would see a lot of flashing red lights. The Chinese authorities, they're dealing with three big problems at the same time. So the first is debt repayment. 80% of China's overseas lending portfolio is currently supporting borrowers in financial distress. So that's the first problem. Problem number two is that a lot of Beijing's overseas projects are risky from an environmental, a social, or a governance perspective. When China first got into the global infrastructure market, it had only 17 problem projects, and those were worth just about $450 million. If you fast forward to today, now they've got 1,700 problem projects worth nearly $450 billion with a B. And these headaches are really far flung. They're spread across 125 countries. And then the third challenge that they're managing is reputational risk. As Belt and Road projects have run into trouble, China has seen its public approval rating in the developing world plunge. And with the grace periods on many Chinese loans expiring, Beijing is trying to find its footing as the world's largest official debt collector. And, the thing about being a debt collector is they don't win a lot of popularity contests. So, looking forward, the reason why this overseas lending program remains robust is that Beijing's trying to solve those three problems. They are not going to stand by and watch their flagship global infrastructure initiative crash and burn. That's just not going to happen. So they're trying to address this in two ways. There's a short run strategy and a long run strategy. In the short run, they're effectively on a rescue mission. So they're scanning their global portfolio and they are firefighting in response to these crises. They're refocusing their time and their money on distressed borrowers, on troubled projects, and on sources of public backlash. But they're also playing the long game. They are working behind the scenes to prepare for the second act of the Belt and Road. They're doing that by putting in place loan repayment safeguards and project implementation guardrails. They're really designed to kind of future-proof the Belt and Road initiative.
Right. And as you said, towards the last part of your answer, there's this system of loan repayment safeguards and guardrails to the Belt and Road Initiative, right? The report discusses these measures that China has taken to sort of future-proof the BRI, including increasing collateralization, where I think the report says that today almost 72% of all lending requires some sort of collateral or state guarantee given by the borrower, right? So what sort of saw this change in China to start instituting these guardrails? And what are the measures themselves? What are these guardrails that China is using to future-proof the BRI?
Yeah, so there's a backward-looking part of their strategy and a forward-looking part of the strategy. So there's the existing portfolio of loans, and they're trying to de-risk that part of the portfolio primarily through their use of escrow accounts. So, they have a lot of borrowers that have fallen behind on their repayments. So what's going on behind the scenes is that Beijing is effectively paying itself, and it's doing that by sweeping US dollars and euros out of the cash collateral accounts of its borrowers. And then if borrowers ask for some type of relief, like a cash-strapped borrower might come to Beijing and say, hey, look, I'm in a tough spot. I need a temporary suspension of repayments, maybe for 12 months or 24 months. What Beijing does, its playbook, is it says, look, if we've already depleted your cash collateral account, we'll grant you that cash flow relief that you're seeking. But in exchange, we need to get a counterpart commitment from you to replenish the collateral accounts, the cash collateral accounts that have already been depleted. And this strategy is really kind of shrouded in secrecy because both China and its borrowers, they're worried that other creditors who have no recourse to cash collateral are really going to take exception to this idea that they are subordinated, that they are now junior creditors whose loans should be repaid on a lower priority basis. So that is kind of the backward looking part of the de-risking effort. But Beijing is also making these longer term course corrections to kind of future-proof the overseas lending portfolio. So rather than relying on its own banks to vet borrowing institutions and prospective transactions, Beijing is increasingly outsourcing risk management to Western commercial banks and multilateral institutions with stronger due diligence standards and safeguard policies. So we were very surprised to find that today, 50% of China's non-emergency lending portfolio in the developing world is now provided through collaborative arrangements with a group of banks known as a syndicate. And 80% of their syndicated loans, China's syndicated loans to developing countries, involve Western commercial banks and or multilateral institutions. So that pivot, towards syndication and multilateralization, reflects the fact that Beijing is trying to move Belt and Road off a strictly bilateral track. And it's also trying to spread repayment risk as well as reputational risk across a larger group of lenders inside and outside of China. So, the way I think about this strategy is kind of as a de-risking shortcut. it could take them years or even decades to try to overhaul the standards and the safeguards of their own bilateral lending institutions. And so basically, Beijing is not taking any chances. It is entrusting its surplus dollars and euros to credible third-party loan administrators, the banks that are responsible for arranging these syndicated loans. And it's essentially telling them to find good projects that will produce good returns, and ideally returns that are better than what Beijing could otherwise achieve through its own banks. So in some ways, it's a tacit acknowledgement of the insufficiently robust nature of their own, of the repayment guardrails that are in place within their own banks.
Right. And the first part, which you said was sort of backward looking, which is this cash collateral, like this, it's not new. Beijing has been using this. I think as per your report, Myanmar in 2010 for the loan from Beijing had to set up an escrow account with $77.5 million in it. And of course, once the BRI started, Angola, I think, had to keep $1.5 billion after the deal in 2015. This is essentially countries keeping US dollars from their reserves in this account that China can unilaterally swipe this money out. Right? But then an interesting part of this safeguard, I think, step 4 in your report suggests that they're also creating revenue accounts that for their projects that automatically replenish this sort of escrow account. So my question is, we've seen before BRI the use of escrow accounts. So there was some sort of thinking of this guardrails in China, before their overseas lending took off. But since BRI took off, and in the last 4 or 5 years, as per your data and your research, has this cash collateral become the key for China's sort of future proofing? One. And the second part of this question is, has it seen its growth during BRI 2.0? Is this what China goes with its agreement saying this is something that you must do? And if so, why do countries still say yes? Because this, imagine your project revenues are tied up to your loan. So what does a domestic country get from this, right, when they sign these kind of deals?
Yeah, so we need to maybe drill down a little bit on escrow accounts. So in a typical Chinese loan arrangement with a developing country, there are 2 escrow accounts for each loan. So the first is the cash collateral account. So in that case, you would deposit somewhere between 5 to 10% of the face value of the loan in an escrow account where you cannot touch that money, like that. It's dead money. It sits for the lifetime of the loan, just as a deposit that the lender can access in the event that you miss a repayment. Then you have a second escrow account, and that is often called the revenue account or the proceeds account. And this account is really for regular debt service. So let's say you're going to make semi-annual repayments to China. You're going to make a repayment on January 21st and July 21st. Those are the most common repayment dates. Typically, what would happen is if the project, the infrastructure project is revenue generating, let's say it's the standard gauge railway in Kenya, the ticket revenue from the railway would be deposited in the revenue account. And so if there's enough money in the revenue account, it's no problem. The lender will just withdraw the amount that is owed on January 21st or July 21st. However, if there is insufficient revenue, the lender can satisfy its own need to be repaid by dipping into the cash collateral account. But the way that they have set up these escrow account arrangements is that there are multiple lines of defense. So there's an automaticity clause in the contract that says if we have to dip into the cash collateral account, the escrow account bank, a bank responsible for overseeing these accounts, they have the authority. In fact, they have the responsibility to immediately replenish the cash collateral account with the money in the revenue or proceeds account. If that second line of defense doesn't work, it's not fail safe, then that's probably an indication that the borrower is in severe financial distress if there's insufficient money in either escrow account. And so chances are that borrower is going to come back to the lender, plead poverty, and say, look, I need cash flow relief. I need some sort of help here. And that is the point at which Beijing will typically say, we're willing to give you cash flow relief, but in exchange for that, we need a counterpart commitment to replenish these escrow accounts. So that's what happened with Angola. China Development Bank provided a $15 billion loan to the Ministry of Finance. The borrower was required to put a tenth of that, 1.5 billion, in the escrow accounts. When oil prices plunged, Angola's main source of US dollars, they were not able to repay their debts. And so China Development Bank said, no problem, in the short term, we'll pay ourselves by grabbing the cash out of the escrow accounts. But once those accounts were depleted to zero or nearly zero, the Ministry of Finance of Angola came back and said, look, we would really benefit from 2 to 3 years of additional grace, kind of a payment moratorium, to wait until oil prices recover and we have more access to US dollars. And CDB, China Development Bank, said, happy to do that, but the price of admission is you need to replenish that the escrow accounts to 1.5 billion within 18 months, which Angola did agree to do. So this kind of gives you a sense of the playbook, that is being replicated in a lot of different countries and sectors. This is these safeguards have really been in place for a long time. It's just that, I think of it as pulling the, you don't use the emergency, you don't pull the emergency handle until there is an emergency. And so these cash collateral accounts aren't really useful to the lender, and they're not really painful to the borrower in normal times. But in difficult times, in crisis settings, then these safeguards essentially get activated. And that's what we're seeing all over the globe, right? Is that the lender is now making use of safeguards that really have been there all along, but haven't been put to use. And then with respect to your second question about, is this becoming sort of like a central feature of China's approach in BRI 2.0, I would say not so much. This is primarily a set of safeguards used by China Exim Bank and China Development Bank. And those were really the workhorse lenders through which China built the Belt and Road Initiative. And now what we see happening is that Beijing is rapidly ratcheting it down its use of China Development Bank and China Exim Bank, and it's rapidly ratcheting up its use of China's state-owned commercial banks. So this is ICBC, Bank of China, China Construction Bank, as well as its use of these non-Chinese banks in syndicated loan arrangements. And I would say in these kind of BRI 2.0 lending arrangements, it is less common to observe the same cash collateral arrangements that are standard in China Exim Bank and CDB loan agreements. It doesn't mean they do not exist during the BRI 2.0 era, but they're becoming less common.
Right. And so these kind of emergency hatches that China has inbuilt and sort of fenced out of, other agreements. So has created an image that China is a tough creditor. With Sri Lanka, with Zambia, I think they took almost 18 months or close to 24 months to even agree on some sort of, we'll sit at the negotiating table after Zambia instituted a sovereign default, right? So there's this image that China is not the best of people to take money from, the sort of reputational sort of risk that you mentioned earlier. But I just want to understand, How has its reputation actually been impacted by BRI? Because some startling figures within the space of 2 years, 2019 to 2021, their reputation plummeted from 56% approval to 40% approval, right? And this is despite them trying to evolve from this kind of tough creditor kind of image. So how exactly has its reputation sort of been damaged in the last few years?
So I think there's countervailing forces going on. On one hand, as some projects, Chinese finance infrastructure projects, are being completed on time or ahead of schedule. In those cases, sometimes we see public opinion improving, a lot of favorable media coverage, and the political leaders of these countries drawing closer to China rather than distancing themselves. But then in other places, you have infrastructure projects that have gone off the rails. Public antipathy towards China is increasing. Media coverage is souring, and the political leaders in these countries are often trying to create distance. Or if they choose not to create distance, often what we see is a political opponent emerges that it takes a less favorable position towards China. So things have become a lot more complicated for Beijing. They're really facing a tough test of their acumen as a reputational risk manager. And so I think that has become even more, the challenge has become even more acute during the period that you referenced, 2019, 2020, 2021. What's going on during that period is a lot of the grace periods on the loans are expiring, right? And so, as I mentioned before, if you want to win popularity contests, being the world's largest official debt collector is not the best way to do that. And so I think this is just an increasingly tough look for Beijing, especially as it starts to take heavier-handed tactics that kind of set it apart from other creditors, like the seizure of cash collateral from its borrowers that we just talked about. And I think what we're watching is Beijing learn in real time that it can't do these types of things without paying a reputational price. We've really entered a new era where debt repayment is defining the relationship between China and the developing world. And I think Beijing is finding that there's a really difficult trade-off that has to be managed between repayment risk on the one hand and reputational risk on the other.
Right. And that brings me to my last question. And this question stems from the fact that in your report as well, you've pointed out that the early part of the loans used to be big dollar loans for big infrastructure projects, but now they're drawing that down and replacing it with emergency yuan financing. If you could just take us through the thinking of sort of bringing in the yuan as sort of the currency now as emergency financing, given that it was big dollar before, right? So why is China sort of shifting in that sense?
Yeah, so when the Belt and Road was in its heyday, it was a dollar-denominated lending program. And the reason why it was denominated in dollars is because China had recurring trade surpluses with US and other countries and had a dollar surplus. And so up until the 08-09 global financial crisis, it was parking a lot of its surplus dollars in US treasuries. And then when the crisis hit and the US Fed did quantitative easing, that reduced the rate of return on those surplus dollars. So that was really this moment of truth where China's State Administration on Foreign Exchange started pulling dollars out of US treasuries, and it started entrusting its dollars to its state-owned banks and telling them to go hunting, to go hunt for yield, to get a rate of return that is better than what Beijing would otherwise get in US treasuries. And so then, if you fast forward 5, 6, 7 years, some of these dollar-denominated loans end up performing lower than the creditors' expectations, and borrowers increasingly found themselves in distress and unable to repay their debts. And so what we find in our latest update to our global database of Chinese lending is that the way that Beijing responded was by ramping down infrastructure project lending and ramping up emergency rescue lending denominated primarily in RMB. And so most of the rescue loans are coming from China's central bank, the PBOC. And if you want to sort of understand the unusual response here, right? We've got a dollar denominated debt problem, and we're trying to solve that problem with Chinese yuan. It doesn't really make sense, right? Because the debtors have to repay in dollars, not in RMB. And I think to sort of really understand the logic of this, the best thing is to look at what's happening in Argentina right now. So Argentina is the single largest recipient of emergency rescue lending from China. It receives roughly $20 billion a year denominated in RMB from the PBOC in kind of short-term debt. And what we have seen just in the last several months is that the government of Argentina has repaid its outstanding debts to the IMF in Chinese yuan. So they've taken the proceeds from these Chinese emergency rescue loans, and they've taken advantage of a policy change at the IMF, where the IMF can now accept repayments in up to 5 currencies, one of which is Chinese yuan. This is a policy change that was advocated for by the Chinese authorities. And so by repaying the IMF in Chinese yuan, Argentina is preserving its meager US dollar holdings. Well, why would China want Argentina to preserve its very scarce US dollar holdings? Because that's the only way that they are going to get repaid, right? They denominated their infrastructure project loans to Argentina in dollars, need to be repaid in dollars. So they have an encompassing interest in ensuring that the Argentine authorities have access to dollars to repay those loans.
But that's a very unusual system. But I imagine going through your report, there's been a lot of unusual methods of international financing that generally, can be classified under China's overseas lending projects, sort of they're learning on the job. Problem, evolve, which is a very interesting characteristic of the BRI vis-a-vis, I think, the Western lending institutions, which is only now entering big ticket infrastructure projects that China did 10 years ago. I think the US recently invested $553 million in a port in Sri Lanka just yesterday. Saying that, thank you so much, Dr. Parks, for joining us. That was my last set of questions. It really, gave us a highlight of how the BRI has evolved, as how China has evolved as one of these overseas lending countries and institutions today. It's not just a country, but an institution in overseas lending in that sense. So thank you again for joining us.